Welcome to part 6 of Module 201A. This is the last video for this section and we will be covering objective number 9 on ratios and proportions. We use ratios to create a comparison when we have multiple numbers of the same object, such as if you had 30 breakers in one bucket and 5 breakers in another bucket. I could say I have a ratio of 30 to 5, or to simplify it, it would be a 6 to 1 ratio as far as the comparison between the two buckets. Proportions are when we have two equal ratios. So when we have 2/3 or we have 8/12, they'd both be the same value if we were to convert it to a decimal point. Therefore, they're both proportionate values. When we talk about proportions, we have two different types of proportions that we can deal with. The first type of proportion is a direct proportion. A direct proportion means that when I change the value of one side, I'm also going to change the value of the other side in the same direction, the same amount. So if I change side A by doubling its value, I'd also be doubling the value of side B in order to keep that proportion the same. So when it comes to heaters, for example, a small heater, we carry a small current. A large heater, we carry a large current. So the proportion between the two sides are the same. And if I change the proportion of one side, I'd also change the proportion equally on the other side. So by changing it from a 1200 watt heater to a 1500 watt heater, I'd also see that my proportion on the secondary side going from 10 amps over 20 amps to being 12.5 amps over 20 amps. The way I solve proportions for missing value is I want to use a method called cross multiply and then divide. So in our case of the heaters, I would take the 1500, multiply it by the base on the other side, the denominator, so 1500 multiplied by 20, and then I want to divide it by the other denominator, which is 2400. The result is 12.5. This way I can calculate how much the ampacity of that heater is going to be. So my 1500 watt heater should pull 12.5 amps. And I know that because my 2400 watt heater is pulling 20 amps. By understanding the proportions and the ratios that go with the proportions, I can predict any missing values. The other type of proportions that we have are indirect proportions. What this means is that when one side goes up, the other one goes down the equal amount. The most common example of this is how many men are on the site to work at the same time. So if I have 20 hours of work and I have 5 people, that means it's going to take 4 hours to complete it. However, if I have 20 hours of work and I have 10 people, that's going to mean it's going to take 2 hours to complete it. So the more people I have, the less time it takes, which means that they're inversely proportional. Now we see this as well with resistance and current. The more resistance I have, the less current gets through. If I double my resistance, I halve my current. That's an excellent example of what an indirect proportion is. When we're solving indirect proportions, we can still use cross multiply and divide. However, the important thing is that we have to take one of those ratios and flip it. It's always a good practice to have the smaller number of each ratio on the top of the formula. That way, when we cross multiply and divide, we can still solve for the correct term as long as we understand the relationship. And by adding more people, for example, or adding more resistance, we get less current, and that's what we're expecting to see. Congratulations, you made it to the end of 201A Math Applications. We have gone through order of operations, transposing, squares and square roots, scientific notation, SI prefixes, my favorite Pythagorean theorem, trigonometry, addition of phasors, and ratios and proportions. Make sure you go through the module and you understand all of these things because we're going to be building on a lot of them as we go through the course, especially with the scientific notation, Pythagorean theorem, and trigonometry, and addition of phasors. Those are the most 4 important mathematical concepts that you need to understand before moving forward. So make sure you got a good grasp on them. In the meantime, you can return to Blackboard, complete the worksheet for part 6, as well as the knowledge check, and then move on to 201B.